Laurent, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My wife Sonia and I are so thrilled to be here together in Paris for the first time together, and I'm so honored to be speaking to such an august gathering. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Isabelle Marquis and Philippe Boudbois and the late Claude Carrier, who read earlier versions of this, published versions of this paper, and I appreciate all their help. First, happy Jazz Appreciation Month to everybody. This is something we established at the Smithsonian 22 years ago. So this is the 22nd Jazz Appreciation Month. Every year we issue a poster, and people do events all around the world, across the United States. This year's poster features Leroy Neiman's portrait of Miles Davis, and we've also in the past issued posters of Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn. And I brought the Billy Strayhorn poster along. We have enough to give everybody here one.
Oh, nice.
We don't have any more of the Duke Ellington, but we do have a Billy Strayhorn for everyone. In the long and storied career of Duke Ellington, who was born in 1899 and died in 1974, no nation except his own played as significant a role as did France. Ellington enjoyed a long and rich association with France, especially its City of Light, spanning 40 years. He performed in Paris and 26 other French cities, played nearly 100 concerts, and made radio, television, and film appearances, most of them in Paris. In Paris, he performed nearly 50 times. France had proved hospitable to jazz beginning in 1918 when U.S. Lieutenant James Reese Europe's band took the country by storm. The American drummer Louis Mitchell took his band to Paris and remained there for a decade. The clarinetist Sidney Bechet had performed in Europe in 1919 and lived and performed in France during the latter 1920s. Yet visits from top-notch American jazz musicians to Europe were rare at the time. Ellington's first appearance in Paris was, as we just heard so brilliantly from Jean-Francois, was during the lowest point in the Great Depression, 1933. Besides the adulation he received during his 1933, what else affected Ellington? It was the way his music and performances were treated. The European tour was different, primarily stage shows and concerts. The experience stimulated his ambitions in his career as a serious composer. Put simply, the band leader in Ellington liked America, while the composer in him preferred Europe. Before Ellington and longtime manager Irving Mills parted company in 1939, Mills arranged a tour to Ellington, a return to Europe for the orchestra, a 34-day tour consisting of 28 concerts, each booked at $1,000. The threat of war was everywhere in 1939. The band left the United States amid serious war jitters because no one knew what would come next. The entourage included Ellington, 13 instrumentalists, and singer Ivy Anderson. When the party landed in April 30th. When the party landed in Le Havre, according to Downbeat magazine, hundreds of jitterbugs stomped and shouted at the dock. Cornetist Rex Stewart recalled the scene and the feeling. There were a lot of people from all over France to meet us, members of the various hot clubs, both fans and musicians, who all greeted us with such absolute adoration and genuine joy that for the first time in my life, I had the feeling of being accepted as an artist, a gentleman, and a member of the human race. Upon arriving in Paris, Rex Stewart recalled, the band was met by the train station by a big contingent of jazz buffs and so many pretty girls. For the first time in my life, I realized the tremendous scope of this music and the general acceptance throughout the world from a cultural standpoint. The most significant aspect of this 1939 tour was that it gave Ellington a chance to perform almost exclusively for listeners. Except for one stage show, these were concerts, his most extensive concert circuit since his first European tour of 1933. After holding a press conference in Paris, the orchestra played 2 concerts at packed houses at the new National Theatre de Chaillot, one of the largest concert halls in Paris. This is the way it looks today and the way it looked back in the time. As were Ellington's 1933 concerts at the Salle Pleyel, these performances outside the normal circuit of music halls and nightclubs were seen as confirmation that jazz deserved to be treated as a serious art. Both concerts were completely sold out. At each session, the musicians performed about 38 numbers, according to press reports, for 2,800 enthusiastic listeners. Quote, "We were accorded an uproarious reception," Ellington wrote, "and were forced to play innumerable encores." The reviews were glowing. Here's Sonny Guerrero. The Paris newspaper Le Figaro marveled, "By what orchestral imagination does one arrive at strange fluted sound effects, atmospheric vibrations with powerful humor?" Variety's Paris correspondent reported that Ellington and his orchestra wowed the Parisians. Ellington was feted by musicians and nightclub proprietors alike. His music was hailed by Jean-Henri Levesque, the Paris critic, as, quote, "related to the rhythm of the atom," and as, quote, "revealing the very secret of the cosmos." The poet Blaise Cendrars was ecstatic. "Such music is not only a new art form, but a new reason for living." When Ellington moved on, he left a lasting legacy in Paris, thousands of old and new fans, and greater interest in his recordings. In Paris, Ellington was treated as something of jazz royalty, which of course he was, and was feted at cocktail parties. His cornetist led a small group recording session as Rex Stewart and his footwarmers for Swing Records. The quartet consisted of Stewart, Ellington's clarinetist Barney Bigard, his bassist Billy Taylor, and the great guitarist Django Reinhardt. They recorded 5 tunes: Montmartre, Low Cotton, Finesse, I Know That You Know, and Solid Old Man. Here's just a taste. Waxes rhapsodic about this group of sides, calling them, quote, "among the all-time gems of small group jazz, virtually in a class by itself, masterpieces of chamber jazz, amongst the finest achievements of jazz. They are gemstones of jazz that should be heard by every appreciator of good music, of whatever ideological persuasion." Ellington had several encounters with Reinhardt, who would, in later years, toured the U.S. with the maestro. When the Hot Club of Paris opened a new headquarters, Reinhardt was one of the performers, and Ellington was in the audience. After our very successful European jaunt, recalled Rex Stewart, the band started hitting on all cylinders like a wonderful musical juggernaut. Indeed, many experts consider the next 3 years or so the peak of Ellington's entire musical career. The band, blessed with considerable stability of personnel and buoyed by its European accolades, would make one masterwork recording after another. The World War II years created a number of serious problems for American bands, including Ellington's. The war negated any possibility of Ellington performing on the continent and made his records more difficult to secure overseas. His admirers in France would have to wait 9 years between his last visit and the next. In 1947, Stewart, having left Ellington, found upon visiting Paris that the French, quote, had been craving our music all during the long war. Incidentally, next to nylon hose, the most valuable export was that sneaked by the German noses, American jazz discs.
Wow.
Ellington again toured Europe for 6 weeks in June and July 1948. Here he is arriving at the railroad station. That's Boris Vian to your left, and to your right is the producer, Jules Borkan. The British Musicians Union refused to allow his band to join him, so he only took trumpeter, violinist, singer Ray Nance and the coloratura soprano Kay Davis to play as a variety act. Nance was a sensation, for he played trumpet and violin, sang, danced, and clowned, and stole the show at every performance. Again, the concert included a dignified program booklet. Ellington, Nance, and Kay Davis were accompanied by a trio of British musicians on guitar, bass, and drums. At the Salle Pleyel, the audience was expecting Ellington's full orchestra, and when the curtain went up, reported Ernest Bornemann, the audience gave a great gasp of disappointment at finding a trio on stage. But within 20 minutes, Duke has captured them. And a pattern becoming recurrent. Ellington was idolized. This is a wonderful printed program. You can see the repertoire. He was idolized, photographed, and honored. The late 1940s were a difficult time for Ellington, who was facing a decline in the ballroom and nightclub business back home for big bands, falling sales of jazz records generally, which reduced recording opportunities for himself, resulting in financial pressures. And he was facing continuing problems with the stability of his personnel. In the midst of these tough times, Ellington returned to the fans who had earlier rejuvenated him, and he undertook his first European trip for the whole orchestra in 11 years. After arriving at Le Havre on April 4th, 1950, the orchestra played 74 concerts in 77 days. Ellington was booked to give 5 concerts at Paris's Palais de Chaillot. The promoter, Jules Borkan, issued a handsome program booklet. But there was trouble at the opening concert. The audience was unhappy with the selection of pieces. The Paris concert, according to Der Spiegel, was a, quote, sensational disaster, during which the band was almost booed off the stage. Melody Maker magazine from England reported the audience, quote, almost gave vocalist Kay Davis the bird. After Lush Life, interrupted by shouts and whistles, she ran off the stage. The audience wanted more of the old Ellington jazz, end of quote. Nearly Ellington's entire repertoire was his recent material, since he and his orchestra had not performed in Paris for 11 years. There was evidently a time lag, and his fans were not ready for the new Ellington. They wanted the old, familiar Ellington. Yet Ellington was idolized. You see him in the middle of the crowd with Boris Vian and Jules Borkan, mobbed and well publicized. Also in 1950, he made an appearance at a racehorse farm, perhaps as a publicity stunt for a newsreel. You'll see a little bit of it here. these clips up, but we have so much to cover in a limited amount of time. Ellington weathered difficult seas in the early 1950s. His leading player, Johnny Hodges, bolted the band in March 1951, taking with him several other top musicians, Lawrence Brown and Sonny Greer. Altogether, the three had 70 years with the band. Ellington bided his time until Hodges returned to the fold in 1955. From 1956 to the end of his life would mark the second great arc of Ellington's career, as he and collaborator Billy Strayhorn increasingly wrote extended works, suites they called them, that took full advantage of the longer playing time of the long playing 33 1/3 RPM record. During this period, as rock and roll was siphoning off most young listeners, Ellington increasingly turned abroad for bookings. In the fall of 1958, Ellington and his orchestra returned to Europe for nearly 50 well-received concerts in 30 cities. The second of two concerts on October 29th at the Alhambra Theater in Paris was recorded by Radio Europe and issued on record and later on CD. This was the occasion in which the eminent late photographer Herman Leonard took this iconic photograph. Ellington was filmed at Club 33, having fun with some ladies.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, I mean, there are certain musical devices we have employed, like in 1935, that were used by other people in 1945 and called modern. And on the other hand, a more striking example, you might say, some of our 1930 devices were used by rock and roll in the 50s. And so I think we're very fortunate to be in that position.
Okay, here's where he's having some fun with ladies at Maxine's. We don't have time to look at the film clips, but in the 1950s, Ellington's music was adapted for several ballets here in Paris. In 1960, Ellington received a film commission to write the music for the United Artists production, Paris Blues. Filmed in the City of Light at the Studios de Boulogne, this motion picture starred Paul Newman with Sidney Poitier as expatriate American jazz men, Joanne Woodward and Diane Carroll as their girlfriends, and Louis Armstrong in a cameo appearance as trumpeter Wild Man Moore. For Paris Blues, Ellington composed in Hollywood during November and December 1960, then flew to Paris for 3 weeks, during which he composed and played a bit while the band had a holiday. The score that he and Strayhorn created incorporated several evergreens as well as a number of new tunes: Amour Gypsy, Autumnal Suite, Big Bash, Night, Paris Stairs, Battle Royale, Wild Man Moore, and the title tune, Paris Blues. The score was recorded by 3 different ensembles: a group of studio musicians in California, a mix of American expats and French musicians in Paris, and some final material by a studio band including current Ellingtonians and alumni in New York. Though the jazz press found the movie's story disappointing, it applauded Ellington's music, especially the underscore of background music, which was nominated for an Academy Award. This shot from the film features the drummer known as Mustache and pianist Aaron Bridgers, to whom we'll return in a moment. For me, the most surprising aspect of the film's score is the use of atonality in the incorporation of Ellington's 1947 classic, The Clothed Woman. In the original, two atonal sections sandwich a middle, slightly ragtimey section. In this excerpt, we get through the first two parts. Recalling his stint in Paris, Ellington later wrote, quote, "It was the closest thing to a vacation I've ever been able to think about." You see him with Louis Armstrong. He enjoyed his time in Paris in part because he had time to have fun. And was feted at parties given by notables such as actors Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, the record and film producer Eddie Barclay, and the French composer Georges Auric. While at Paris, Ellington was invited to perform at a midnight mass and played Come Sunday, presaging by 4 years the major composition he would write, A Concert of Sacred Music. Paris Match publicized his and Armstrong's visit in December 1960 with this large photo showing a crowd of well-wishers that included butchers, creamers, and other working people, seemingly to testify to the two musicians' popularity among ordinary Parisians. Here's how the same hotel looks today, a photo courtesy of my dear friend Philippe Baudouin. Ellington was honored by the city of Paris and by the Hut Club of France. While in the City of Light, he was commissioned to compose a musical score for a revival of Torquemada, the comedy by Alain René Sage from 1709. Please pardon my French pronunciation. It's pretty bad. Paris Blues and Torquemada were among the very few times that Ellington composed for an ensemble other than his own orchestra. My good friend Laurent Mignard has recorded Torquemada, and we will hear some of it on Saturday night. Correct? I enjoyed writing the music for Paris Blues, he said in 1961. I still keep writing and think I must be just about getting my second wind. Have written more in the last 2 years than for the 10 years previously. In fact, Ellington and Strayhorn were in the midst of a composing streak that yielded, in addition to Paris Blues, such extended works as The Queen's Suite, the film score Anatomy of a Murder, and reimaginings of Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite and Grieg's Peer Gynt Suite. In 1962, inspired by his sojourns in Paris, Ellington recorded the album Midnight in Paris, with 13 tracks evoking the City of Light. In addition to Ellington compositions Guitar Amour and Paris Blues from the film Paris Blues, the album included Strayhorn's Midnight in Paris and 10 standards associated with Paris, such as Edith Piaf's No Regrets. Billy Strayhorn had a special relationship with the City of Light that went all the way back to the imagined Paris of his youth. When still a Pittsburgh teenager, he penned the fatalist torch song, Lush Life, with its memorable line, "A week in Paris will ease the bite of it." Strayhorn spent long stretches of time in Paris and had a long romantic relationship with the expatriate African-American pianist Aaron Bridges. The year 1963 would see Ellington travel abroad more than he would in any other year, a total of 174 days, almost half the year. In January 1963, the Ellington Orchestra traveled to Europe for its second longest foreign tour to date, 61 days in Western Europe. The band played 3 concerts at Paris's Olympia Theater, which were recorded and issued in the United States as Duke Ellington's Greatest Hits and the Great Paris Concert, showing Ellington in especially fine form as a band pianist and his orchestra on fire. According to the New York Times, the audiences overflowed into the aisles. The reception could hardly have been warmer. Also, with symphony and opera orchestras of Paris, Hamburg, Stockholm, and Milan, the Ellington band made an album called The Symphonic Ellington that finally realized his dream to record Night Creature, a composition from 1955, which Capitol Records and Columbia Records had been unwilling to record. Despite a terrible winter, the concerts of the 1963 tour were thronged and the newspapers were full of glowing praise. This trip may rank as the most successful foreign tour of Ellington's life. The trip was not without its downside, however. Ellington, now 63, contracted pneumonia and spent 5 days at the American hospital in Paris. This illness underscores what a demanding, even grueling schedule he found himself having to keep. When he was 30 and touring in the United States, he would often sit down for a 1, 2, or even 3-week engagement at a theater or nightclub. But now, with changing musical demographics and economics, in order to keep the band together, he had to keep up a killing pace, consisting, whether in the United States or abroad, of long strings of one-nighters, each in a different city, with rarely a day off. I really don't know how he managed that. In January and February of 1966, Ellington made another tour of Europe. In Paris, he and Ella Fitzgerald performed several sellout concerts at the Salle Pleyel. Back home in the United States, Ellington's European travels were a source of pride for the African-American press. From Paris, Ollie Stewart reported in the Washington, D.C. Afro-American newspaper that although there was a general strike in France, sound familiar? It didn't stop the faithful from finding a way to get to play out to hear Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald. Matter of fact, Stewart continued, whenever the word gets out that Duke and Ella are coming to town, nothing short of war can stop them from playing to a packed house. The 2 names are magic that the French can't resist. In the fall of 1969, the band went again to Europe under the auspices of George Wein, founder of the Newport Jazz Festival, for a 70th birthday tour. The trip was grueling, 32 cities in just 35 days, often requiring the 70-year-old maestro 2 performances in 1 day. But it was a big success. While in Paris, the Ellington Orchestra performed at Salle Pleyel for the 5th Paris Jazz Festival, as well as a concert of sacred music at the Church of Saint-Sulpice, which was reportedly attended by 5,000 people and taped for later telecast. Though the church had a ban on applauding, the audience, according to the New York Times, clapped for every number and stomped toward the end. As in the United States, the novelty of fusing jazz with sacred music created a stir. One Parisian newspaper headline quoted the vicar as roaring, "And if they start to dance?" This concert featured one of Ellington's favorites, Alice Babs from Sweden, whom Americans call Alice Babs. And here is a brief excerpt. with Johnny Hodges. Doing Heaven. Can't listen to that or watch that without getting misty-eyed. In Paris on November 20th, there was a large, belated birthday party at Alcazar, one of Paris's most famous cabarets, attended by such notables as Maurice Chevalier, with whom Ellington had first worked in New York City in 1930. And Salvador Dali was also in attendance. According to a UPI wire service story, quote, highlight of the show, apart from an hour of swinging sounds from the Ellington band, was a 10-foot wide cake from which popped 3 nude dancers. The concert was taped and later broadcast by ORTF. The French were not shy about expressing their admiration for Ellington. Among the 200,000 items in the Duke Ellington collection at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History are these commemorative cigar bands created for his birthday. And a copy of a commemorative edition of On Special Durable Paper, De Figaro. In a TV interview, Ellington contended with a clumsy interviewer with Ellington's usual cleverness.
Mr. Ellington, for the French television, Monsieur Ellington pour la télévision française, it's hard to believe that you are 70 years old. C'est très difficile de croire quand vous dites que vous avez 70 ans. Are you sure you are 70? Êtes-vous certain d'avoir 70 ans?
Am I sure?
Yes.
No, I'm not sure.
Il n'est pas certain d'avoir 70 ans.
I'm only going by the records.
I see.
Yeah.
So when was the day or the year or the period of your life when you felt the youngest? À quel moment de votre vie vous êtes-vous senti le plus jeune?
When I wake up tomorrow morning.
By now, Ellington had lost his 2 greatest musicians, Billy Strayhorn, who had died in 1967, and Johnny Hodges in 1970. But Ellington soldiered on. He continued to perform live concerts and to make recordings, both for a growing private stockpile and for issue by record companies. A highlight of a 1970 tour was a solo piano concert Ellington taped in Paris for ORTF. In fact, I consider this tape one of the most remarkable film or video recordings Ellington ever made. How many of you have seen this? Okay, thank you. He is alone in the television studio, speaking and playing directly to you and you and you. No interviewer to intervene. Remember, you are all the audience, members of the unseen audience at home. His intimacy is palpable, his musicianship extraordinary, his charm polished to a high luster. Here are two excerpts.
Of course, every time I come to Paris, I'm a little, extremely concerned about what to play and of course, what to say. Of course, that's something else again. And of course, there's so many interesting things and so many interesting people that I would need a much longer time to actually discuss it in detail. I mean, I should think we would start with the citizens of Paris. One was Django Reinhardt, who was a very dear friend of mine, and I had him with us in the United States on a concert tour. So much so that, we didn't even have him billed because I was so eager to have him there so I could enjoy him, very selfishly indeed. And then, of course, there's Bechet, Sidney Bechet, who worked with us in 1926. Incidentally, we did a portrait of Sidney Bechet in a new album that's coming out sometime soon, and I don't think I remember it good enough to play. It seems that I've always had rather good luck in Paris and with people who are from Paris. For instance, the first time I conducted with baton was when I conducted the personal appearance of the inimitable Maurice Chevalier in New York City at the Fulton Theater. And then I was here for 8 weeks doing Paris blues.
Before we leave 1969 and 1970, I would be remiss if I didn't point out to you all that Laurent Mignard and his orchestra played Ellington's Sacred Concert in 6 cities across Paris and produced a wonderful DVD of it. Here's another excerpt from this broadcast. This is Dancers in Love.
Then I have a request to play Dances in Love. Dances in Love is a little bit of an icky tune, which we did back in 1947, I think it was. And it's about the middle, of course it's played by the piano player, and about the middle, there are breaks in the melody, and the gentlemen of the orchestra, as you see the pictures around here, usually fill these breaks by snapping their fingers, 1, 2, 3. And so you, ladies and gentlemen, are all cordially invited to join also and snap your fingers. 1, 2, 3. Dances in Love. I'll tell you when.
One more time. Hold it now. One more time. Watch this one.
Yes. Bon. Merci. Je vous aime à la folie. C'est that.
In September 1971, again under George Wein, the Ellingtonians made an extensive tour of Europe, including 6 concerts in France. However, with the loss of some of the stars, frequent turnover in personnel, and the aging of other players, Ellington was increasingly carrying the show with his public personality and stage presence, now honed to a fine level of smoothness, cliché, and charisma. After 1971, he made a number of recordings, but was glimpsing few new musical horizons. On July 8, 1973, President Georges Pompidou and the government of France gave Ellington its highest prize, the Legion of Honor Award. No American composer had ever been so widely honored, nationally and internationally, as Duke Ellington. From October to December 1973, the orchestra performed in Europe with a brief side trip to Ethiopia and Zambia for the U.S. State Department. His last performance in France was for a concert in Brest. That was November 15, 1973. Just over 6 months later, he was dead from lung cancer. What was the significance of Paris to Ellington? It was psychological, social, and musical. More so than anywhere else in Europe, France conveyed, especially for Black Americans, a sense of freedom, or at least far more freedom and dignity than they were accorded in their homeland in the pre-civil rights era. Especially during the 1930s tours, Paris gave Ellington and his gifted musicians a great deal of validation, encouragement, and musical inspiration. Europe is a very different world from this one, Ellington told his first biographer, Barry Ulanoff. Quote, "You can go anywhere and talk to anybody and do anything you like. It's hard to believe when you've eaten hot dogs all your life and you're suddenly offered caviar. It's hard to believe it's true." France also provided opportunities for Ellington to make significant recordings and television broadcasts and inspired 3 long-form works: the score to Paris Blues, the score for Turcaret, and the Brutalist. What was the significance of Ellington to France? In the 1930s, Ellington had demonstrated to the French with first-hand authority and considerable style and eloquence the enormous artistic power in orchestrated jazz. He set an example for composing with unusual tone colors and individual harmonies, and he created high standards for native French musicians to match. He also validated, inspired, and influenced French musicians such as pianist Raymond Fall, Claude Bolling, and Aaron Bridgers. Fall performed as guest soloist with Ellington in 1969 and a leader in 1974. Among Bolling's chief influences as a pianist are Ellington. Bolling made his first unabridged version of Ellington's Black, Brown, and Beige in 1989, and on March 22, 1996, he led a performance of Ellington's A Drum is a Woman in Paris. The 40 years that Ellington was associated with France was a time, for France as elsewhere, of mass production and no small amount of predictability, hopelessness, impersonality, and derivativeness. In contrast, Ellington affirmed the personal, the human, the hopeful, the heartfelt, the unique, the inventive, and the individual as eloquently as anything. Perhaps that is why his singular music and exceptional life continue to resonate with Frenchmen and French women and others who are attentive to his rapturous legacy. Thank you.